Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor David Enoch, and we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine. All right, Professor, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks for having me. My name is David Enoch. I am a professor of law and philosophy at the Hebrew University. I've been there for about 20 years. And this year I also started as the professor of the philosophy of law at Oxford.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. So this is one of those conflicts where I intentionally have avoided through the years because I feel like it's just so complicated and I don't have the time or the mental bandwidth to understand what's going on. And so I just kind of, click on another headline and read something else or listen to something else. But because it's in the news again, I feel like I should know more about it. And so I'm very happy that you're here. So my first question is just a very basic one, which is fundamentally, how would you describe this conflict? I always thought that it was a conflict over territory. Is that true or not?
It's definitely true to an extent. In general, I think we should resist one-line explanations and certainly one-word explanations. There's no reason to think that such a complicated phenomenon can be captured with sort of a rationale of one word like territory. Territory is without a doubt a major part of what's going on. It's not the only thing that's going on. Extremely regrettably, over the last maybe couple of decades, maybe always, but certainly over the last few decades, it's becoming increasingly about religion, which makes things, of course, so much harder. It's partly about territory and religion, right? Some of these issues are combined, certainly when you're talking about some of the purportedly holy places. Some people will tell you correctly that it's partly about resources, it's partly about history, it's partly about national pride. There is enough mess to go around.
Okay. So what started this conflict then?
The current round or the conflict?
I guess the conflict in general.
Oh, that would take us a long way back. Zionism, which is roughly the Jewish manifestation of a general trend of nationalism in Europe, I guess, in the 19th century. I should say I'm not an expert on the history of Zionism at all, but anyway, Zionism made it one of the main aims was to create a national entity, a state, a nation state for the Jewish people, as a part of an effort to normalize the Jewish people that has survived over many, many centuries, but not in the best of conditions and not as an independent and not a politically sovereign entity. And Zionism has, by and large, though not everyone in Zionism, seeked to do so in the historical homeland of the Jews, which is Israel-Palestine. There are even some say that a part of the ethos of Zionism was that there is this land without a people that will now again be for the people without a land. Except that there were people here. They were just not Jews and not very keen on Zionism. There are, of course, controversies about whether it's correct to describe them as the Palestinian people from very early on, but there were certainly people here in Palestine living over the ages. And they were always a kind of obstacle for traditional Zionism. Again, Zionism is not a kind of unified theory. It's not as if you have to be a card-carrying member and sign on to some thesis, let alone some plans or a specific politics. But it is true that the Zionist movement has been partly about this territory being the place for the national home of the Jewish people, and people who don't fit this kind of pattern were an obstacle. Then we have to talk about specific events over history, about which, as I already said, I'm not an expert, but there has been, of course, a lot of violence from all sides. Jumping ahead a little bit, in 1948, what Israel calls the War of Independence, and many Palestinians call the Nakba, the disaster, maybe the Holocaust, included a lot by way of ethnic cleansing, not a lot by way of massacres, though that too is, of course, contested, but certainly a kind of conscious effort to push many non-Jews out. That's how the refugee problem was initially created. Then although there are also, of course, many Palestinians who remained in Israel proper, and are citizens, discriminated against, but certainly citizens. Then in 1967, Israel conquered, following a war with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, further territories, creating a second wave of a refugee problem, but also creating the occupation, which we still see to a large extent until today in the West Bank. In Gaza, things were complicated even further. Egypt, at some point, didn't want anything to do with Gaza. Israel withdrew to an extent in the early 2000s, although there are controversies about whether the Israel's withdrawal from Gaza amounts to the end of the occupation or just to a very different way of administering something like an occupation. The Palestinian Authority lost an election, and then by violent means, Hamas took over, and that's the kind of regime we see until today, with, of course, some developments and some changes. There has always been some violence. The violence it's not. It goes in waves. Sometimes there's more of it, sometimes there's less, both from Gaza and from the West Bank. Israel engages in more or less violent actions within those places. In the West Bank, there's also a major settlement project by pretty much all Israeli governments in the past 40-something years, which Palestinians see as a direct attack on their ability to have a Palestinian state there and as a direct challenge to anything resembling a two-state solution. In Gaza, there were settlements to the same effect. They were dismantled, as I said, in the early 2000s, so that's no longer there. The Israeli kibbutzim and villages that were attacked on October 7th were in Israel proper, within the so-called Green Line, the 1967 ceasefire lines. Yeah, I guess that's a good initial historical survey. We can say more, of course.
Even just what you said was very complicated. There are a number of players going on. There's a lot of historical events that we have to take into consideration. So I kind of want to just dive a little bit deeper and unpack what you said. So this Zionist movement, this is a movement, is it composed of Jewish people?
Yes.
Okay. So they want a country for Jewish people.
A kind of nation state, or the national home for the Jewish people.
Okay. And that vision manifested in Israel.
Yep. Although there were some Zionists who thought that was not the best place to be.
Okay. And Israel as a political entity did not exist until after World War II, correct?
1948.
1914?
1948.
Oh, 1948. Yeah. Okay. So it's post World War II. Okay. But were conflicts?
But Zionism preceded both World Wars.
Yeah. Okay. But the conflict there, did that precede the establishment of Israel, or did the conflict mainly start because it was because that's when Israel was created as a political country?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by the conflict. The conflict, roughly as we know it, may have started in 1948, but there have been violent clashes between certainly between the new Jews, but also between some of the old Jews and Palestinians, Arabs who occupied the land. Those have preceded the state by many decades.
Post World War II, they established Israel. These Zionists say, okay, this is the nation state for the Jewish people, and they start maybe pushing other people out of that territory who are not part of the Zionist movement?
So that's not precise. As I said, quite a few Palestinians, non-Jews, remained within Israel proper. And indeed, Israel, in its declaration of independence, vowed to give them full equal rights, which is, it kind of cuts both ways. First of all, it's impressive. It's not to be taken for granted. In the middle of an existential threat and a national war, and Israel vows to guarantee full rights for its non-Jewish citizens and inhabitants. On the other hand, it's one thing to state this in the Declaration of Independence; it's another to actually act accordingly. And this tension has always been a part of the state of Israel. But yes, we know that in 1948, in this war, it was certainly the aim of at least many Zionist leaders to make sure that the percentage of non-Jews within what will become the more stable kind of state of Israel, will be at the at most manageable.
Okay. The idea being that if you wanted to be the nation state or the home for the Jewish people, then maybe a sizable portion of the population has to be Jewish and kind of identify with that culture.
Correct. So the promise and the hope was to be simultaneously, and this is a phrase that is very often used, although it's not entirely clear what it means. The hope was that Israel would be a Jewish democratic state. Now, it's not exactly clear what Jewish means, and it's not fully clear what democratic means. But it is very clear that if there is not a substantial Jewish majority of citizens in Israel, then it cannot be both Jewish and democratic in significant ways.
I see. Okay. So then the non-Jewish people who are living in that area felt pressure or discrimination to either leave that place or stay there and be treated as second-class citizens, or no?
Again, officially, no. Officially, the rights were guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence. During the 48 War, of course, there are many different reports, and they vary, and there are controversies about it. But we know that there were some cases of massacres. Certainly, there was a lot of violence because, the emerging Israeli military often fought against and within Arab villages that did fight the relevant Jewish villages. So the whole thing was mixed. But we know that there were cases in which the message was made very loudly and clearly that you better not be here later on. And we know of a huge refugee movement, both up north to Lebanon, also east to what then was Jordan, and in 67 became the occupied territories, and also partly south to the Gaza Strip. The people with the Arabs, Palestinians who stayed within Israel, they, in some respects, do have equal rights, certainly in formal respects. They vote for the Knesset, for the Israeli parliament. They are elected to. There have always been Palestinian members of the Israeli parliament. They can work wherever they want. They can move around the country wherever. I'm saying all these things because if you're a Palestinian from the territories, you do not have these rights, right? So this distinction is still important and clear. They have the relevant social rights. They pay taxes, right? They are citizens. But as we know from many other cases of minorities, national and otherwise worldwide, the fact that a minority does have full formal legal rights does not yet mean that they are fully equal, that they have the same opportunities, that they share in the relevant symbolic capital, and so on. So in all of these respects, there is, I don't think there can be a doubt that the non-Jews, mostly Palestinian population of Israel has always been, I don't know if you want to call it a second-class citizen, maybe it is, but anyway, clearly discriminated against in many ways, including development budgets, all the stories that we know from minorities elsewhere. But it is also true, say, unlike when people talk about apartheid, that they did have all of the formal rights of citizens. They still have, but they always have had since 1948. I should say that between 1948 and 1967, this was also qualified because most of the Palestinians within Israel were under some kind of a military regime within Israel. They could vote for parliament and be elected, but many of their civil rights were limited. But since 1967, that's not the case.
Okay, so there are a couple of these territories that I hear about, and I don't really understand what the relation between them are. So there's Gaza and the West Bank. And I think I looked on a map once. Those two areas are not connected, are they? Like geographically, they're not connected.
They are not. Actually, a part of the Oslo Accord from the 90s, that was the moment of hope when we thought we may be approaching a two-state solution, allowed for some creative solutions to the problem of territorial disconnect between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. You should know, by the way, that all of the dimensions in Israel are ridiculously small. So you're right that there is a disconnect. But if it weren't for political problems, it would have been something like a 40-minute drive between Gaza and the West, or between the close spots on Gaza and the West Bank. So there were attempts to secure a kind of secure passageway between the two territories, But you are right that they are not territorially continuous.
Okay. So are both areas part of Palestine? Or is Palestine a larger geographical area? Or is Palestine just the Gaza Strip and the West Bank?
There is no, here's a general lesson about this tortured part of the world. There is no uncontroversial terminology. If you just want to get your terms right, you're already wrong. So it's not clear what the word Palestine or the name Palestine refers to. The Palestinian Authority is now in control of the West Bank. It was supposed to be in control of Gaza, but was ousted by Hamas. When people talk about Palestine, they sometimes refer to all of the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, which includes today the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Israel proper. Sometimes when people talk about historical Palestine, they also include the territory that is now, that has been since 1947, I think, or 8, that is now the state of Jordan. A large portion of its population is Palestinians. So that too is complicated. According to the Oslo Accords and according to any reasonable suggested two-state solution, the state of Palestine, not the historical territory that may have been called Palestine, or indeed the historical territory that may have been called the land of Israel, right? Forget those. The political distinction, to the extent that there's ever going to be a reasonable two-state solution, then Palestine includes, roughly, with some minor amendments, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
That is definitely a sign of a very complicated conflict if people cannot even agree on basic terms like geography. Okay, so why are these two areas famous or notorious? Why do I keep hearing stuff about Gaza? Why do I keep hearing stuff about the West Bank? And I don't hear anything else about other parts of Palestine, however you want to define Palestine.
As I said, the other parts that maybe are part of historical Palestine, the main part is just Israel proper. Israel, in its best moments, likes to think of itself as a Western, democratic, I guess sort of liberal, pretty much capitalist, successful state. And when a state has all of these attributes, then you don't hear about it in the news. Right? So that would be good. In the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, the territory is now controlled by the Palestinian Authority. There are, and again, estimations of numbers vary, but at the very least 2 million people, 2 million Palestinians, probably more. No, 2 million is now the estimate for Gaza. And for the West Bank, it's probably, I don't know, 1.5 million. I don't know. Don't take my word as, serious estimate here. But millions of people who live under, in the West Bank, clearly under military occupation. And in Gaza, not exactly under military occupation, since the Israeli dismantlement of the settlements there and its withdrawal, but certainly under strong Israeli stronghold, for instance, of the borders and of everything, pretty much everything else. They do not have any kind of citizen rights. They do not vote. They are not controlled. To an extent, at least, they are not controlled by their own. Again, this is different. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority does have some powers, but the Israeli military has overruling powers to a large extent. There are further complicated distinctions. In Gaza, it's not exactly this way. Of course, it's not remotely a democracy, partly because Hamas, independently of Israel and the occupation, Hamas is not remotely a democratic organization. But yes, they clearly live under an occupation. According to anything resembling a reasonable two-state solution, according to the Oslo Accords, according to as far as I know, the policies that are still endorsed by, say, the American administration and the European Union, they are supposed to form, to a large extent, the future independent Palestinian state. That's why you're hearing about it. That's where the main conflict is.
So I remember having this conversation, a brief conversation with a Jewish person many years ago about this conflict. And he said, I think it was about Gaza, that it's basically a prison. It's an open air prison. And is that true? Well, one, and was he talking about Gaza or was he talking about the West Bank?
He was talking about Gaza. For the last almost 20 years, Gaza has been under a siege from Israel since Hamas rose to power there. There are, of course, controversies about that as well, about what explains the siege, what Israel's rationale for placing it originally was, what its rationale for never lifting it was. All of this is coming. But it is true that people who live in Gaza, by and large, cannot leave Gaza. Uh, Gaza, again, if you have a look at the map, Gaza is almost surrounded by Israel, so it borders with Israel on Gaza. The Gaza Strip is also extremely small. It's the size of a big city at most, right? It's very small. So on its north side and its east side, its border is only with Israel. Then on the west, it's the Mediterranean, controlled by Israel, and at the south there's a small, fairly short border with Egypt. Egypt has not been more friendly to Gazans by and large, partly because it has serious worries about its own integrity. It doesn't want refugees coming from Gaza. And Israel has put this blockade over Gaza over the last almost 2 decades, which means that if you're in Gaza, you by and large, you don't get out. There are some exceptions, but not many. Israel has allowed workers to go into, over the years, to go into Israel proper. This has been an important contribution to Gaza economy. And over the years, we've seen more and less of it. Of course, since October 7th, none of this is going on. Israel has allowed Gazans to leave Gaza Strip for humanitarian causes, for instance, to get treatments either in Israeli hospitals or in hospitals of the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank. I have myself volunteered in some NGO that drives these people from the Erez passageway to either hospitals in Israel or the West Bank and back. That too has stopped since October 7th. Also, Israel has almost complete control over merchandise going in and out of Gaza. So the Gazan economy is also under Israeli control. I say almost because first, there is this border with Egypt, right? Egypt wants not to have anything to do with Gaza, but it's not clear that it can afford to do so either politically or morally. Also, there are, as often there is from what I understand, a rather flourishing economy of smuggling, mostly at the Egyptian border, which Israel has limited control over. This applies both to economics and, but also, of course, to weapons and anything a war-related industry.
Okay. So then Gaza is kind of like a prison, but is that a result? Is that a reaction to Hamas and attacks from Gaza?
Again, as I said, everything is controversial. Historically speaking, there was no siege, no blockade, nothing along these lines until in the early 2000s, until Hamas took power and also launched missile attacks and other attacks. So this was certainly introduced as a retaliation, perhaps, but also as an attempt to control the ability of Hamas to get to build all of this huge underground military operation that we see today to get to either get or manufacture weapons and so on. But as is often the case, many people think that this was more an excuse than the real reason, or that it was initially the real reason, but that the reason to keep the siege in place afterwards was different, that there were other considerations relevant there. And of course, some people in Israel, not too many, on the Israeli left have always criticized this policy.
So let's get to Hamas then. You said that Hamas, did you say they violently took control? Political control?
It was combined. There was, but yes, that the ultimate means were violent. They killed and forcefully ousted Palestinian Authority people.
Yes. Okay. And Hamas wants Israel to not exist?
Hamas has an official ideology, right? They have documents, clear statements. Hamas is a jihadist extremist Islamic organization, and they have precisely the kind of ideology you would expect. So yes, they think they had. We now know that they had sort of operational plans of what to do once they conquer Israel on October 7th and or thereabouts. I should say also that Hamas itself is it doesn't speak exactly in one voice, and there are different. There are in Hamas the more pragmatic lines with whom perhaps some arrangement, at least temporary, could be made. And yet there are those extremists who are talking, a fully religious extremist jihadist language. And one of the unfortunate things that happened on October 7th is not just that that was a very much an operation of the more extreme part of even Hamas, which is already extreme, but also that because of the success of October 7th, this part of Hamas has gained more power, apparently.
So according to the official documents, they don't want Israel to exist. Now, does that, like, what does that mean exactly? Like, as a political entity, they don't think Israel should exist, or does it also include elimination of the Jewish people? Does it mean just pushing Jewish people out so that they can live somewhere else? Or does it mean actually killing Jewish people?
I'm not an expert on this, but I believe that the right answer is a combination of all of those, and different people in Hamas may hold, different parts of what you just mentioned to different extents.
Okay. Yeah. The reason why I'm asking about this is because the issue, again, is just so complicated. And I feel like if any solution is going to be found, my gut feeling tells me that you have to take the entire history into consideration, because the people in the conflict are affected by this history. They know the history to some degree. And so if philosophers, I feel like, are going to have something useful and practical to say, they have to at least know what the basic facts are,
Knowing the facts seems like a good idea. I'm not a historian, not by a long shot, but I'm not sure you're right. Think about the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland. So, of course, you had to know a lot about the facts in order to know which arrangements may survive and which may not. How does one achieve stability? And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the relevant knowledge was historical. But also, I would be surprised if that was the most important part. So it seems to me that solutions are reached at least as much by forgetting history, or by letting it go, or by understanding that historical grievances will always remain, and yet we must find a way of stopping killing each other. So I think that the people I want holding the wheel, as it were, on both sides, are the decent pragmatists, not the historians or the nationalists, certainly not the religious people, certainly not a specific genre of religious people, and probably not even the philosophers.
So then, here we come to the big question. What do you think a just solution to this problem is?
I am a strong believer when it comes to politics in reduced expectations. I don't think that we should aim at that. So I'm going to be paraphrasing Judith Shklar here, who says, we shouldn't be aiming at the highest good. We should do what we can to avoid the worst kind of bad, right? I'm not sure what is meant by a just solution. I want a solution in which people stop killing each other and, if possible, suffer a little bit less. To the extent that I understand what people talk about when they talk about justice, that is justice. And I'm willing, as I said, so some people, when they talk about justice, talk about historical justice, right? Something along those lines, which I care about, but only derivatively. I care about it only because I suspect that a too unjust arrangement is unlikely to be effective, certainly not across time in a way that will diminish suffering sufficiently. Okay, so with those qualifications in hand, I don't think that there is anything other than a two-state solution of some kind on the table. What I'm concerned about is not whether there is another alternative that I missed, but whether there is no alternative at all, whether even the two-state solution is no longer in any way practicable. I hope that's not the case, because otherwise there is just ongoing war and massacres on all sides and tremendous amounts of suffering.
Yeah, I can only imagine how somebody who's directly involved and affected by this conflict is just so sick and tired of this conflict continuing, his constant violence, you know?
We shouldn't ignore the facts. Apparently, there are many people on both sides who are not sufficiently sick and tired of this. There are many people on the Israeli side who seek what our prime minister, I believe he calls, the absolute victory, first in Gaza and maybe elsewhere as well. There are certainly many Palestinians. Recent polls have been especially worrying, but I'm willing to think of them as not fully representative. But still, there are many, many Palestinians who seek nothing like an exhausted peaceful arrangement, but a full victory. For many years, I hoped that the way forward will be when the two sides are sufficiently exhausted. The kind of image I always had in mind was, I don't know if you have this image too. Sometimes if you watch a heavyweight boxing championship, in the late rounds, they will sometimes lean on each other. It will feel as if they are supporting each other. Of course, they are still there to win, but they are so exhausted. It's not that they are suddenly, they don't care about winning anymore. It's just that the exhaustion becomes the overwhelming motivation. Right? So that's the kind of picture I had in mind. Nothing romantic about how we will love each other, but perhaps we will be sufficiently exhausted to lean on each other and seek some kind of practicable arrangement. I still hope that that's a possibility, but it's hard to be optimistic.
Okay, so for what I'm getting from you is that there were kind of militaristic hawks on both sides that are not sick and tired of the violence, that they're okay with it continuing because they are seeking absolute victory or complete victory, which is basically we just conquer the other side, right?
Right now, on both sides, I think that these are not just military hawks, but they're typically religious extremists.
Okay, so now there's that other level of religion that it's like intertwined with this conflict. Okay. Do you think this conflict would be as bad if it were not for the religion?
This is very hard to say. I think that historians, for instance, are not fans of such counterfactual questions. And also, I should say that religion comes in many varieties, right? So there are impressive people, for instance, in Israel, Jews in Israel, who are fighting the occupation and doing what they can to help Palestinians on the West Bank, and to do it out of religious Jewish motivations. There are such organizations, for instance, Rabbis for Human Rights, amazing, admirable organizations for whom their religion is not only isn't it a motivation for hawkish views or for more violence, but in fact it is an extremely strong motivation for peace and reconciliation. And I'm sure that there are voices like this also on the Muslim side. And there are very few Christians now. There have been more among Palestinians, but I'm sure that there are voices like this there as well. So there are different. It's not as if religion is this one size fits all, hawkish, whatever. But I do think it's true that these days the influence of a jihadist version of Islam among Hamas and among other organizations like the Islamic Jihad is extremely destructive, and also some horrible messianic nationalist form of Judaism, which is becoming more and more central on the Israeli side, is also extremely destructive. One of the problems which many people mention is that the kind of rational or pragmatic discourse that includes things about normal lives, normal prospering, deterrence, the deterrence of death of oneself or of loved ones, all of these things either no longer work or anyway work in a very different way once a sufficient extremist religious view is involved. So my inclination is to think that yes, religion by and large in the Middle East makes things much, much harder. But again, religion works in different ways for different people, and it's complicated.
Yeah. I kind of get the sense that there's the political sphere and the religious sphere, and they're two very interrelated spheres. So there's like a big section in this Venn diagram that overlap. And there are also many people who disagree amongst themselves within each sphere and even in the area where the Venn diagram intersects, right? So it's disagreement all around. So October 7th then, okay? Is there agreement at least that there was an attack on Israel and then that attack killed a lot of people?
I don't know that there's an agreement on anything. One of the things that some people, I guess, on the Palestinian side or Palestinian supporters will say is that there's something superficial about starting things on October 7th. There were many attacks over many, many years on both sides and so on. But as far as I can see, no one can reasonably question the following. In Gaza, there was a kind of a status quo, which included, the occasional attacks on both sides, but very, very minimal and pretty much under control. Then on October 7th, mostly Hamas, also Jihadi Islam and others, but mostly Hamas, I don't see how it can be disputed that Hamas started not, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but that round was started at Hamas's initiation with a surprise attack on many on the fence. So they breached the fence in several locations. They attacked both Israeli military bases and many Israeli kibbutzim and villages. Those attacks included the indiscriminate killing of many, many innocents. I think the number that people throw around is roughly 1,200 people, Israelis dead on October 7th, of whom roughly 3/4 were civilians. This was not collateral damage. They were going home to home in some of the kibbutzim and some of the villages, killing everyone, setting places on fire, and so on. And also taking many hostages. I guess the initial number was between 200 and 300, 300 of them. There is some controversy over the over questions about sexual violence. I don't see how there can be such controversy. The evidence is overwhelming to the extent that there can be overwhelming evidence for such thing, because of course the vast majority of the witnesses have been slaughtered. But that has become a kind of issue of contention, although as far as I can tell, no serious person questions the data now. There are controversies about the details, about the number, about the nature. There are also questions whether those engaging in the worst kind of violence, say sexual violence, were Hamas operatives or rather the mob, because the breach of the fence was so unbelievably successful that many people who were not even Hamas operatives just followed in their footsteps. But I don't see how it can be denied that many hundreds of innocents were intentionally killed in their homes, slaughtered, kids, old people, young people, everyone, no distinction at all, and that many were taken hostages. It took Israel a tremendously long time to respond. I mean, there were some initial responses, but the Israeli military, to say that it was a disappointment is, of course, an understatement. It was a colossal, historical failure, both in terms of intelligence and in operational terms, in how long it took for reasonable amounts of military forces to reach the area. So many people say that for a while, Hamas actually conquered at least parts of the western Negev, or the area surrounding the Gaza Strip. But then, of course, after some time, Israeli forces did arrive, and they ousted them, also killed many of them, captured many of them. And it was clear that there was also going to be a response within Gaza, which it took some time, but which we have been seeing to an extent ever since.
Yeah, in one way that we can understand October 7th as just another attack among many attacks that have happened historically. So in one sense, it's not special. Okay, maybe the extent of it is what makes it special than the previous attacks, but
it is very, very special in more than one way. One way in which it's special is just in the sheer magnitude of the failure of the Israeli forces to defend its people. Another way in which it's special is these places that were attacked, I'm talking now about the civilians, I'm not talking now about the military bases. They were perfectly tranquil. I was there many, many times just because I was there, or on my way to the border with the Gaza Strip to pick up people for to take them to Israeli hospitals, or the other way around, right? These were civilians in their homes. It's like the worst scenario you can imagine. So that was also a way in which it was special. Another way in which it was special was the sheer magnitude. So many people say it's the worst disaster for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And while I typically think that references to the Holocaust are unhelpful, here both in terms of how horrible that day was, the numbers, but also in terms of the experiences of many people. So these were people in their homes trying to hold the door against all odds in the kind of sheltered room they have there in order to protect their children from people who were there in order to slaughter them. Okay, there is no way of minimizing that experience, and that trauma is one that will live on in the lives and minds of Israelis for decades to come. There is no way around this at all. And perhaps another way in which October 7th was special is that it showed, and maybe this is something that many people believed already, but some of us did not. It showed just how unlimited the hatred and the willingness to kill innocents is. So it was clear that the only thing that may restrain this is not all the Palestinians, obviously, but may restrain these people, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, is just their ability to do so. In terms of their motivation, there is no upper bound to how morally horrendous and painful they are willing to be. So in all of these respects, October 7th was extremely special, unique in the history of the country.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So in terms of Israel's response then, I remember hearing that one option, I didn't hear people say, well, Israel just shouldn't do anything in response, that some response was justified. The real question was about how that response looked like. And I think one person said what Israel should do is kind of make more like a surgical attack or something, or surgical moves, and not just, I guess, bombing, which is less surgical because there's a lot more collateral damage in that way. And I know this is a question for like a general or something, but I don't know what the right response.
Here, you only have
you got two philosophers.
Left.
But yeah, I mean, like, as far as you can tell, like, what do you think the reaction should have been?
So I have very little respect for people who, perhaps from the philosopher's armchair, issue strong declarations about what should be done in complicated factual cases about which they don't know anything. And I think that some of the responses we've seen have precisely been those. For instance, given both the density of the population in Gaza Strip is one of the most heavily populated places on Earth, most densely populated places on Earth. And given some of the Hamas tactics, we know where they place their headquarters and so on, talk of surgical operations is much more an instance of wishful thinking than a serious strategic or tactical suggestion. On the other hand, it's certainly true that there are different ways of conducting such an effort, and you can emphasize more bombing from the air or forces on the ground, and you can and there are different trade-offs that you can have between, say, taking care with civilian population of the enemy and with your own forces and so on. But the hope for a kind of a clean surgical commando action that will involve killing all and only Hamas operatives and also freeing the hostages, that's for Hollywood. It's not for the Gaza Strip. There have been different stages, different actions within as a part of the Israeli action. Clearly, for instance, there have been some claims that Israel should just protect its border and that's it, not get into Gaza at all. These are, I think, idiotic claims by people who don't understand the first thing about how force is used in such environments. There have been claims that, any innocent person dead in Gaza is murdered by Israel. That's an idiotic claim by people who don't understand how modern warfare looks, perhaps any warfare looks. And the notion of collateral damage, however problematic it is, but still. On the other hand, it's also clear, I think, that Israel has been excessively liberal with its understanding of collateral damage, so that any kind of operation now includes either the risk of collateral damage or certain collateral damage. But there's a question of proportionality, or how much you allow, and Israel has been way too permissive in this, I think. There have also been other violations. Perhaps the most important thing, I don't know if it's one of the important things, is that Israel has not done what it could and should have done from the beginning to ease the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And when it has done some things in that respect, it is done mostly as a response to American pressure. That, I think, was in any way indefensible. But the truth of the matter is that in order to protect its citizens, which is something that Israel has both a right and a duty to do, against what we now know about both the motivation and the abilities of some of its enemies, and given what we know about the arena as a whole, for instance, about the Hezbollah threats from Lebanon in the north, I think that it was morally mandatory for Israel to respond in an overwhelming way, which is why I defended at least parts of Israel's response early on. I also think that Israel has done a very poor job in being way too permissive on collateral harm, not being sufficiently strict on easing the humanitarian crisis from the get-go. I mean, initially there was only an expected humanitarian crisis, but we knew it was coming, and that should have been worked on from very early on. And we should add another thing, and that's that at least some of the statements by Israeli officials, by members of cabinet, by high-ranking military officers and so on, have been entirely indefensible from the get-go. Some of them have been in terms of revenge. Some of them have been borderline genocidal. Now, I hope, and to an extent, I think, that the effect of these statements on the actions on the ground has been limited. But it is true that if you're going to fight a really messy war, if you're going to insist on the moral need to respond in an overwhelming kind of way, in a devastating kind of way, then you had better be extra careful about these other things. For instance, about humanitarian aid, and about making sure that no one in the decision-making forums is motivated by revenge or by genocidal sick fantasies. And in all of these ways, Israel is clearly failed.
I remember watching this debate between some pro-Israel person and pro-Palestine person, and it just ended up in a yelling match, and nobody wanted to concede any ground. And it made me think that if that is representative of the conflict, then that conflict is never going to end.
Well, look, no two people are representative of the conflict. And people are allowed to not always be at their best. Think Ireland again. I think that even quite shortly before the Good Friday Agreement, it seemed intractable as well. And suddenly, in terms of hatred, it was deep. Maybe it's still deep, right? Or the German and the French were not exactly each other's fans following the First or the Second World War, right? But now a war between Germany and France seems unimaginable. Changes happen. Unpredictable changes happen. Also, horrible disasters happen. The most optimistic I've got is to say we can't rule out the possibility of a good, surprising change. But nor can we rule out even further deterioration and much, much more suffering.
Yeah. Another question that I had, I wish I could get into the minds of these actors. Is like, what is the end game? What is the plan? Because when I hear about these attacks and when I hear about this violence, I keep thinking this is going to lead to more violence. This is going to create more terrorists or lead to more terrorism. right? I remember Malala Yousafzai. I think she met Obama once, and the first thing that she told him was that his drone strikes were creating more terrorists than they were killing. I don't know if that's true. That's an empirical claim, but it sounds plausible at least that, if you kill my family member, that's going to radicalize me, and now I want to kill you and your family. And I don't, it's just, it's hard for me to see how that actually ends.
I think that is a valid consideration, but I think it's an oversimplification to treat it as the only valid consideration. So I think that many Israeli attacks do, of course, create more antagonism. And I'm sure that there are many future terrorists who are motivated or created now. Similarly, of course, for people, say, family members of victims of the October 7th massacres by Hamas. Okay, so here's a place where philosophical distinction can be useful. And that's the distinction between pro tanto significance and all things considered significance. So sure, pro tanto, that counts heavily against all of these attacks. But there are also other considerations that count for it. Let me give you what I think is both the most convincing and the most problematic example. And these are deterrence considerations. And here's the example that I have in mind. In 2006, I think, I often don't remember the exact years, there was a kind of a round between Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, and Israel at Hezbollah's initiative. Israel responded rather overwhelmingly, especially the Doha neighborhood in Beirut. Hassan Nasrallah, the chief of Hezbollah, is on the record saying afterwards that had he realized this would be the Israeli response, he would not have started that clash. On October 7th, Hezbollah did not join Hamas. And Hezbollah has been shooting at Israel. Israel has been shooting at Hezbollah since, but in a very controlled way. Now, it's a very good question. Why did Hezbollah not go all in on October 7th? The answer is, of course, very complicated. It may have to do something with the interest of Iran, one of its major sponsors, perhaps its major sponsor. It may be partly because they were angry with Hamas for not sharing the information with them, or indeed taking part in the decision. I don't know, it's complicated. But it seems to me very clear that a part of what played a role was precisely the deterrence effect of the 2006 Israeli devastating, overwhelming response to Hezbollah starting the war then. Notice that if that's true, then the overwhelming, the devastating bombings within Beirut of Israel in 2006 saved many, many thousands of lives, perhaps millions. Because had Hezbollah gone all in on October 7th, first of all, it would have killed many thousands of Israelis. But second, then Israel would have faced an existential threat and would have responded in ways that make its actions in Gaza since October 7th seem like child play. Deterrence is both extremely important and also very uncertain, very open to abuse. That's why I said it's both the most, for me, by far the weightiest consideration and also the most problematic one. So perhaps devastating bombings within Gaza have the effect that you are talking about, of antagonizing even more people and so on. I would be shocked if they don't have this effect. But if they also serve to deter the next all-out war with at least one and maybe two order of magnitudes more people hurt, then all things considered, it is still justified.
Yeah. The last thing that I want to get your opinion on is, I guess, the role of philosophy in all this stuff. Because, I did my master's in political philosophy. I thought about justice, and I think often I just focused on ideal theories, and I feel like that branch of philosophy, like some other branches of ethics, they're not, I guess, that relevant in the real world, because they're not designed to solve any particular problems. They're designed to solve particular philosophical puzzles that philosophers like to think about, right? And just in terms of what a better world looks like, I feel like we have a good enough idea, right? I think reasonable people have a good enough idea of what a slightly less bad world looks like. And the role of philosophy, and political philosophy in particular, is not really relevant. What do you think?
By and large, I agree. I'm not sure I fully agree. I think that ideal theory is fine. but you shouldn't do ideal theory and then, as it were, forget that you did ideal theory and try to apply it to the world. Right? Um, there are interesting questions. I've even written about them a little bit about the relation between ideal and non-ideal theory. So, can you do ideal theory and then somehow make the necessary amendments or something in order to apply it to the real world? Um, I think that philosophers can be of help to the extent that we are careful thinkers. But that the way to do that is to first be extremely epistemically modest about what we can and cannot know. Second, understand that we don't have a relative advantage when it comes to the facts, but the facts are extremely important, right? You can't that just you can't overstate the extent to which the facts are important. And if you want to do real world stuff, you had better address the facts of the real world. But I do want to use like maybe two. I don't remember the quotes exactly, but points from others who have been writing about ideal and non-ideal theory. So Amartya Sen somewhere has this famous example where he says, it's not as if in order. So suppose you're facing two mountains, and you're trying to determine which one is higher, which one stands taller. Right? You don't need to first know what the tallest, highest mountain in the world is. Right? You can just start from here. And I think Liz Anderson somewhere says that often to do political philosophy, you don't have to imagine the best world. You just have to start from the wrongs around you. So I think that to an extent, that's right. I think this conflict is, if you are so inclined, extremely interesting. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily extremely philosophically interesting. If you are fortunate enough to be, as you mentioned earlier, to be able to afford not knowing about it or spending your time doing other things, by all means, you can do other things, including purely theoretical puzzles. That's fine. But if you want to have something to say about the real world, you'd better have a look from time to time at the real world.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.